but by that I mean I'm facetious, because we have this picture which is weird, but it may not be complete. It could be that those beings living 100 billion or trillion years from now will have access to observational information of some sort that we don't have today.
We don't know about. Yeah.
And so we should have some kind of cosmic humility, which is very difficult for cosmologists.
Let me come on to the. I want to ask you about the very title of your book and the idea of something from nothing. You are telling us that matter arose spontaneously out of nothing, which I find an immensely exciting idea, but many people will find it mind-boggling.
Mind-boggling and offensive. I think maybe not as offensive.
To hell with offensive, but
no,
mind-boggling.
No. Well, you're not offended, but I checked my email. It amazes me because the purpose of the book, to some extent, is to say something remarkable. And you were kind enough afterward to point out the analogy to Darwin, and I was pretentious to make it, perhaps. But the physicist Steven Weinberg said, science doesn't make it impossible to believe in God. It just makes it possible to not believe in God. Because until you have science, everything's a miracle. And what Darwin showed, as you said at the beginning of our discussion, is this miracle is actually plausible from basic principles of physics, chemistry, and biology. That you can produce us without a creator, without an intelligence. And what we've learned is remarkably this question, which is, in the sense of cosmology, in my mind, the last bastion of those people who feel there must be a creator, is the fact that it is plausible, based on everything we now know, that a universe could come from nothing. Now, that doesn't mean it did come from nothing any more than Darwin's argument implied that life absolutely originated by chemistry. We don't know that yet. Similarly, we can't prove that the universe arose from nothing, but the discoveries in physics and cosmology have led us to realize that it's increasingly plausible, and I find that remarkable and worth celebrating. And one of the examples of that, and there's a number, but maybe some of them are too much for us to talk about tonight, is this remarkable fact that nothing is unstable, that empty space is unstable. The laws of quantum mechanics, combined with gravity, will tell you that if you have empty space there, and you wait long enough, particles will be created. And if you wait long enough, empty space will always produce a universe full of matter. And it's not a scam. There's no violation of energy conservation. It's from the fact that gravity can have negative energy as well as positive energy. And so nothing is unstable. And in fact, that's the first answer to why there's something rather than nothing, is that nothing's unstable. The big surprise would be if there was nothing. Not that there's something. Now, the problem, of course, of saying that is people say, that's not nothing. That's not, and and it's an interesting problem, because when I've discussed this with theologians and philosophers, some of them, and you ask, what's nothing? And my argument is that these are scientific questions, not philosophical or theological ones. And I think the nothing that Aristotle would have had, or say Thomas Aquinas, or any of the people who first asked why is there something rather than nothing, that nothing would have been an eternal empty void, namely empty space. But once I argue that empty space can create something, then immediately I'm told that's not nothing.
Yeah.
And then I show that space itself can be created from nothing, and then I'm told that's not nothing. And then I say, well, because there are still laws of physics. And then I argue that, in fact, the laws of physics, for the reasons we've discussed, the anthropic principle, there may be many universes, and it's quite likely that even the laws of physics themselves arose by accident when the universe was created. So even the laws aren't there. And I'm told that's not nothing. And the definition of theologians, I think, for nothing is that from which only God can create something. And I find that sort of content-free, although I think I say in the book that maybe I'm not fit to talk about nothing because theologians and philosophers are experts in nothing. But anyway,
I've been accustomed to the idea that pushing back from biology into physics, you get back to a zone where we don't understand, and you get back to a zone where there's not nothing but sort of a primeval simplicity. What I learned from your book, which I find stunningly exciting, is that it is literally nothing. I mean, that's what really, and as you say, even the laws of physics
and space,
you can explain.
Space, you can create a universe where there's no space before.
Yeah. So I do find that it's sort of mind-numbing in a way, because it's pushing the Darwinian dream to an extreme, which biologists couldn't have dreamed of.
I think in a sense it is, and it's fascinating to me that we're beginning to get there, and I think that's worth sharing. We don't have the conclusions, and we don't have a dogmatic conclusion, and we'll get back to the fact that it amazes me, and I think you find the same thing, because I know what I've read about you, by people who disagree with you, is if you say this is possible, then you're suddenly told that you're shrill and dogmatic. But we'll get there. But before we do, I mean, one of the things that we just talked about is how amazing the universe really is. And I want to turn back to you. We talked about my book, but you just wrote a book called The Magic of Reality, which is ostensibly supposed to be for children. I wanted, if you could talk about why you wrote it and why you think it's important.
Well, any scientific book that's important is worth writing for children, because they're the future, and as is often said, the sort of natural born scientists in any case. So I'd always wanted to write a children's book, but actually I like to think that it's readable, it's understandable by adults as well.
In fact, I would argue, yeah, I often say if the children understand, there's a possibility the adults don't understand it. But in fact, I wrote a blurb for the back of the book, and I really think, actually, while it is in principle called a children's book, it actually addresses the very questions that not just children but adults ask. The kind, maybe you can indicate a few of the questions.
I haven't attempted to answer these very profound questions we've been talking about, which belong in the field of modern physics, 20th century, 21st century physics. I haven't tackled that at all. The physics that's in The Magic of Reality it's 19th century physics.
But most people don't know 19th century
that's
physics.
Right.
I think I mean, I don't want to do a disservice to people, because you can get along in life apparently without knowing it. But to be able to deal with those basic concepts without being patronizing, and I think the book isn't patronizing, I think it makes it accessible and of interest to adults too.
I mean, it's questions like why do we have winter and summer? Why do we have night and day? I mean, even easy questions like why do we have winter and summer? It's amazing how many people think the reason we have winter is that's when the Earth is furthest away from the sun.
I was going to ask the question here.
Are you okay?
No, it's all right. We've already given it up. But
okay.
But
I mean, I haven't. It's just if there are any Australians present, they would.
They would know the difference.
Yeah.
In fact, studies have been shown, if you ask that question, the majority of people will say, in summer the Earth is closer to the sun than in winter.
Well, as an Australian would say, Northern Hemisphere chauvinism.
Yeah, exactly. It's the tilt of the Earth, and it's described there. But when you were writing with kids in mind, did it change the way you wrote compared to when you were writing?
I think just a bit of restriction of vocabulary. I like to, when writing for adults, use the full vocabulary at my disposal. And I think it's fun to, we have a beautiful instrument in the English language, and I think we should use it to the full. But when writing for children, I would tend to avoid using words that too many words that need to be looked up in the dictionary. I mean, there's no harm in looking words up in a dictionary, and we should all do it from time to time, but you don't want to look up too many. So that's really the only restriction.
That was the only restriction. Otherwise,
so.
You didn't find your writing style had to change at all.
Don't think so. No. No.
Yeah, I didn't notice it when I read the book, and I was wondering if there was any conscious thought in your mind. Now, this allows us to segue to something which we would be remiss if we did not discuss, which is religion, and science and religion in some sense. I would suggest that one of the reasons that it's really important to teach kids about science is that they're often that they're brainwashed from a young age with other ideas. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Maybe the fact that...
Yes, I mean, I think that is absolutely true. And when we talked about this astronomer who thinks the world is 6,000 years old, and one knows of many other people who think that, I mean, that is so ludicrous. That's got to be due to childhood indoctrination. There's no other, I think, reasonable explanation. And I think it is a tragic abuse of childhood. I won't say abuse of children because that has other connotations, but abuse of childhood to fill a child's mind,
but I won't use it. Okay.
to fill a child's mind with what are now known to be falsehoods, just because they have some kind of historic origin.
Before we get to that, I want to touch on whether science is incompatible with religion in your view, and why. And I'll talk about my opinion in that regard too. But one of the things that you've set out, well, we both enjoy teaching science, and we want to, and one of my goals and your goals is to help people understand science. But I think it's fair to say that one of your purposes in doing that is to destroy religion, is it not?
Well, I love truth. I love scientific truth, and in my own field of biology, ever since Darwin, we've got a very, very long way towards understanding it. And I'm now learning that in your field, we're coming stunningly close to understanding everything. And that is such a beautiful idea, such a wonderful, exciting, exhilarating idea, that it is, I would go as far as to say, an obscenity to fill a child's mind with a parochial, small-minded, petty, medieval alternative, which has nothing going for it whatever.
It sounds like we're preaching to the converted, but I bet in the question period we'll find we're not.
What was that quote from Stephen Weinberg that you just...
Science doesn't make it impossible to believe in God, it just makes it possible to not believe.
Yeah, I think that's too weak. In the following sense, that it doesn't just make God redundant, it doesn't just give God nothing to do, which it certainly does. I mean, biology, ever since Darwin, has left God nothing to do. And it now sounds as though physics is doing the same thing. But a God who has nothing to do is still a complex, improbable entity of exactly the kind that we spent our lives explaining. So the whole Darwinian enterprise and the whole enterprise that you're engaged in physics is to explain how we can get to things like gods and explain them. And so if you suddenly then import a God at the beginning of the universe, that's a betrayal of the entire scientific enterprise. It's not just that God's not necessary. God's an excrescence, a carbuncle on the face of science.
Well, okay, in fact, I agree with it. Actually, we were talking earlier, I think it's even stronger than that, in some sense. God is not, in order for God to do everything God has purported to do, God has to be much more complex than we are. In fact, you're imagining a being of incredible complexity, in fact, in religion, unfathomable complexity, and you're just positing it by fiat. But you're saying that the complexity of the regular complexity that you or I can't be made by natural processes, and you're postulating that the pre-existence of something that's far more complex than we are.
Precisely. I mean, that's exactly right. And not only does God have to be a master physicist and so on, he's got to be in telepathic communication with everybody praying to him. He's got to know all our sins. He's got to forgive us if he feels like it. He's got to cure people of cancer if he's asked to. I mean, all those sorts of things which are simply adding to the problem. So I think the Weinberg quote that you gave is just too weak. I think we can say positively.
Well, I think at the same time, and I think one has to be careful. But even here, and I should say that our views have come together a lot more. If you listened to us 5 years ago, we were more divergent, I think. And I like to think I've convinced you, but no. But that it's worked both ways. I can definitely attest. But one can say, I think it's important to say that we cannot, and I try and say in the book, that I can't prove that there's no intelligence governing the universe at some vague level, in a deistic level, or even a theistic level, where you say, well, maybe there is some intelligence that caused it all to happen. I can't prove that. What I can say is there's absolutely no evidence of that. That I can say as a scientist. But I can't really say that I can prove, therefore, by lack of evidence, you can't prove it in the negative. But That isn't, but nevertheless, that's not the same as saying, people say, well, therefore, God can't disprove the existence of God. But that kind of God has nothing to do with the God of Judaism or Christianity.